So, what this lecture includes and is roughly how the rest of the debate takes place. Because everything after those first two constructive speeches, like the 1AC and the 1NC, is you're answering and comparing all the evidence that you've read beforehand. And so you might read additional evidence, but it becomes much less evidence intensive in the second constructive speeches and the rebuttal speeches, because earlier on, it's when it's like, here's all the evidence that I'm going to rely and explain later in the debate. All right? There are three generic ways to compare evidence, and I guess before I tell you that, I'll remind you that the first question on the quiz is, what's your partner's name and their contact information? And then the second question on the quiz is, what's the affirmative that you're going to run? And all I need is, like, the Single Payer Act or the UCC affirmative, some like 1 to 2, couple of words description. So those are quiz questions 1 and 2, all right? And so that'll, that's all in you. The next quiz question are, what are the three generic ways that you could compare evidence, right? So in this debate, there are people on both sides of the spectrum that say, universal health care would be good, universal health care would be bad. It'd be good for the economy, bad for the economy. So the three generic ways that you could compare evidence is you compare them based upon qualifications. Who is the author that is writing, and why is one author more qualified than the other? And so some evidence that you'll see going through it will be written by a single doctor. And a single doctor might not be a policy expert in being able to evaluate all the data about how single payer has been implemented in other countries, how it would translate to here, where economist who has been studying, who has no actual knowledge in health proper but understands the economics, might be more qualified to have a conversation on that. But the economist might not be qualified at all because they don't understand how health actually is something different than the economy. So there could be debates over what would constitute a more qualified voice. At the same time, it's like if you're going to talk about inequality that people experience because of a lack of health insurance, like who's most qualified to talk about it could be the people actually experiencing the inequality, or it could be an academic writing about like how they have seen inequality, affect communities and create structural forms of oppression versus just a first-hand, account for it. And so qualifications are one of the things that you could debate about. And in all the evidence that's online, there's generally in the parentheses following the author and the year, it says who that author is and what their qualifications are, and that could all be a subject to debate. If there's nothing there, it's probably because it's just like a staff writer or some random person, which decreases the qualifications. But qualifications does not make or break something, right? So if you make an argument by yourself, it's not unqualified because you are all, people who are undergraduates who have done a decent amount of research and stuff along those lines. And so when you just assert something or make an analytical argument, the qualification behind that is yourself. But if you were going to tell me the Affordable Care Act is bankrupting America, and you're telling me this is just an undergraduate, and the other team has a bunch of evidence that gets into the economic analysis of it, I'm probably going to prefer the evidence than the undergraduate opinion. But that's not always universally true, and it's always up for the debaters to debate about those qualifications. And if neither side debate about those qualifications, then that isn't part of the debate. So one way that sort of helps you win rounds is debating about qualifications. The next thing is publication date. Literally when it was published. And so the economic and political reality of the United States today is very different than it was 3 years ago, is very different than it was 2 decades ago. Right? And so reading evidence about inequality or healthcare or economics or the political reality of, how things would be implemented would change based upon the date. So I have a really qualified author that was writing from 10 years ago. That might not be as good as your author who is not as qualified. Maybe they only have a master's instead of a PhD, but is writing within the past 6 months because they're talking about contemporary issues opposed to the healthcare debate 10 years ago. All right, but maybe that person who's writing with a master's is just is not saying anything, reasonable one way or the other. Yeah.
You said that these are the 3 ways that we can
compare evidence. All right, and the last one is warrants. What are the reasons within the piece of evidence for what they're saying is true? So sometimes people will just assert that the ACA is going to collapse the economy without a warrant to that reason. And so if there's no warrant there, you should be like, you might have a qualified author, but your author doesn't say why it's true, whereas my author, who might not have as many degrees, has warranted out the reasons and explains that medical debt is actually not going to bankrupt the economy, and you have no response for what about the ACA is going to hurt the the economy along those lines. And so you should debate about the warrants within the evidence, when your evidence was published, and what the qualifications are. No one of these things is more important than any one of them. They're all subject to debate. And sometimes, like, publication date might be irrelevant. If we're talking about a moral or philosophical issue, like the moral obligation to help, people who are suffering due to lack of health insurance, that, when that was published is less of an issue than, something more about, the economy or something along those lines. All right? 3 generic ways to compare evidence. All right. The next thing is 3 generic ways to compare your impacts. And so if you remember, impacts and harms are like what really is bad that's going to happen as a result of the affirmative or the disadvantage. And so they are magnitude, how big the impact is going to be. 13,000 people dying every year is a pretty decent impact in terms of magnitude, but it might not be a magnitudinal impact as large as, say, nuclear war, which could destroy the entirety of the planet. That would have a bigger magnitude. Next thing is time frame. How long until that impact's going to happen? A nuclear war might take, 30 years to cascade into actually destroying the planet, where we know every single year another 13,000 people are dying, and so we have to resolve the impacts that are immediately going on, even if they're not as large on a magnitudinal level, right? And then the third is probability. How likely is this thing to happen, right? We know for certain people are dying as a result of being uninsured. The likelihood of nuclear war might only be like 25%. So because of the further time frame, the lower probability, the smaller magnitude of 13,000 people dying every year might be bigger. But a 25% risk of nuclear war that would destroy the planet 30 years from now might make me think it's worth letting 13,000 people die every year if we're all going to go extinct in 30 years and the planetary survival is more important. Those things are debatable. And so, like, you might not be debating about nuclear war or the 13,000 people dying every day, but it's evaluating these sort of impacts in relationship to each other. And even in, like, SPAR debates, magnitude, time frame, probability. Like, we should give up rights to stop terrorists for one of them. Giving up rights means that there is a immediate time frame and a certain probability that rights will be sacrificed. But the magnitude of giving up something like a freedom is tough to quantify because it's not necessarily quantifiable. But the chance of a terrorist attack that could kill us all will have a really small probability, or maybe if you think, a large probability, still not as large, not 100% certain, can result in extinction or a much larger death toll. And so those things are debatable. And so those are one of the things that you should debate about. Because a lot of debates in the last semester ended up like, one team would say, universal health care will hurt the economy, and the affirmative team will be like, but we save lives. And at the end of the debate, neither team said which was more important, and so a lot of decisions were very split because half the class was like, yeah, I sort of think economy is more important, and half the class was like, yeah, I sort of want to save some lives. But like the debates that were clearly won were the ones where one side debated out those sort of 3 different ways to weigh these impacts. Okay? Questions? Okay. Next what are the 5 rules of judging? All right, so you're going to be judging debates, and so after the lecture is over, me and TJ debate, you're going to fill out an example ballot, so that way you just sort of have an idea of what a ballot looks like and stuff like that. And there are 5 rules that you're supposed to do. All right. The first one is pay attention. All right, and that means that, like, if you're on your laptop, that means you're on your laptop taking notes or working on filling out the ballot. The ballot has questions like, what debaters could have done that's better, or what do you think you would have made as an argument? So it is legitimate that you could be writing those sort of things on your ballot. Or if you're interested in something that they talk about, you can feel free to look that up or something like that on the internet, just to be for your own personal knowledge, even if you're not going to insert that in the debate. Playing on Facebook, sending emails, all that other sort of stuff, not paying attention. All right, so that's rule number 1. The second is take notes. So you should have some semblance of notes about what the debate had, because after like 45 minutes of a debate, it's going to be very difficult for you to remember if the first affirmative constructive included certain arguments or did not, if you do not at least take some notes on that individual speech. Okay? Next rule is don't vote on new arguments. So you can't do that if you don't take notes. Remember, once you're in the rebuttals, you can't make any new arguments. What constitutes a new argument is somewhat debatable, and different people will have certain thresholds for that. If you are a good person being like, my partner said this, slowly twisting those words into meaning something else, and the class doesn't, catch that, that's good for you and bad for the other team. But as a judge, if you see a new argument that you are like, I have never heard the team make this argument beforehand, you should not pay attention to it. And on your ballot, you could write something along the lines, I would have voted on this argument. However, the 2NR was the first team that ever mentioned it, so it was not fair for me to pay attention to this in this debate. And then that would be, and then explain why you voted. All right. The other thing, the fourth rule, is dropped arguments equal truth. So if a team drops an argument, you have to, in the course of your decision making, accept it as truth. All right? Yep.
Maybe you're about to explain. I don't really understand that.
So if I say that immigrants are going to come in and bring new diseases that will threaten to wipe out all of humanity, and if we don't have single payer, we will not make sure that we won't be able to give proper health to immigrant populations. If the other team never responds to that claim, that means for all intents and purposes, the immigrants coming to America will be the new vectors that will spawn diseases that will wipe out humanity. Now the other team could have said that was a racist representation of immigration. The other team could have said the likelihood of mutation that would kill all of humanity would be small. The other team could have said single payer is not good enough to stop, diseases from spreading. But if they don't say any of those arguments, you have to take that as truth. And if the team concedes that what I'm going to solve for is extinction, that's a pretty big magnitude that they're going to have to outweigh. It doesn't mean that they've necessarily lost the debate, because maybe there's, a moral obligation that they can later in the debate be like, even if we've conceded extinction, acting morally is more important, and that's interacting arguments and not necessarily a new argument at that point, but extinction is 100% certain in the world where that's been conceded. All right, so dropped arguments equal truth. And that's sort of the same thing as don't vote on new arguments, because if a team doesn't respond to it and responds to it later in the rebuttals when they didn't do it earlier on, it's truth, and you could be like, I can't vote on that argument. Many of my decisions in debate start with something along the lines like, I wish you made these arguments because I don't believe these things, and here's what I would have said in response. But since you don't, I have to vote for this, these arguments. And so your ballots have opportunities for like those educational moments where it's like, if you disagree with what you vote on, you could write that down. But for reasons of voting, we need to make sure that you're voting on what the debaters are saying and adhering to this. Otherwise, what ends up happening is that people who believe one thing will always vote one way. People who believe the other thing always vote sort of another way. And so this is sort of how you, as a judge, be more objective in sort of the way that you calculate this. And the last rule is vote on what debaters say and not your opinion. All right? And so, again, it's a very similar thing to what I was saying just a second ago, is that you can only vote on what the people in the debate round say, regardless of what you believe one way or the other. And on your ballot, it's entirely legitimate for you to express all of your beliefs and help use that time to get across what you believe. And when you debate that team, you should be ready to unload on all the arguments that you think that are different. But when voting, you can only vote on what they say and not on your individual beliefs. Okay? So those are the 5 rules of judging. All right. In a debate, you will be voted for or against, and then you and your partner will be given speaker points. All right. Speaker points work on a scale from 0 to 30, but realistically, they work on a scale of 27.5 to 29.5. And here's why. In the class debate, your base grade starts out as a 70. Your other 30 points come from your speaker points. So you and your partner's grade will be slightly different based upon the speaker points you get. The quiz question is, what is the range of speaker points that you should give? this is the range of speaker points that you should give. I view this as a Netflix scale. So a 29.5 is a 5-star Netflix movie, one that you would want to see again and again. So it was a speech that you were excited about seeing, and you went home and you were like, I'm going to tell my friends about how good this person was, and I can't wait to see them compete in the next round. This is someone who you were really excited for. 29 is like, good speaker, probably one of the best people in the class, but this is still a class, and I'm not that excited about any individual debate, but they were a solid speaker and they deserve to win and do well in the class. 28.5 is your just average student, someone who was fine and was good, wasn't great, maybe won the debate, maybe lost the debate, talked the full time, made sense. 28 is your slightly below average student, maybe had some gaps of time within their speech that wasn't fully filled up, maybe they weren't, you couldn't hear them because either they talked too fast or they mumbled or anything along those lines, but still did well. 27.5 is your honest effort people, where it looks like they did an honest effort, they came to class prepared, they tried their hardest. All right? You are free to go below 27.5 in the world where you don't think they've given an honest effort, where they, did not fill up any of their speech time, clearly looked entirely unprepared, or if they did something that was just patently offensive and you think that is unacceptable, you could give them lower speaker points for that. Like if they use words that you thought that was just offensive to you, or if they used a style of argumentation that was not okay, or they bullied their opponent or their partners or anything like that, you could go lower. But there is a spot on the ballot that says things debaters could have done better. You should explain why that person got lower speaker points. I gave you a 25 because the way you treated your partner by not letting them ask any questions was not right, and you should have let your partner ask some questions. That would be a reasonable explanation. You could go above a 29.5, but if you go above a 29.5, you're really saying this is a perfect, amazing student. This is the person who I'd like to give, that, commencement speech at the end of the year. This is once in a semester, I've given out maybe 3 over the past 5 years of anything above a 29.5. I've given out, maybe 3 or 4 29.5s during the course of a semester over, all the different rounds that people take place. Okay, so it's what is the range of speaker points? The other quiz question is, how many speaker points do you take off for every 30 seconds somebody doesn't speak? And the answer to that is 0.5. So if they were an honest effort person, but they did not use 30 seconds of their speech, then that's actually a 27. All right? And by didn't use 30 seconds of their speech time, I don't mean they had some silence in the, for a couple of seconds in the middle and then another. We're not adding it up throughout the entirety of the speech. But if they stop at 2 minutes opposed to 3 minutes, that's forfeiting a minute worth of their time, which is, then a extra minus point. Okay? So quiz question is, what is the penalty for each 30 seconds that you're done? Okay? All right. If you're curious about how the rest of your ballot is graded or how the rest of the debate is graded, my ballot is worth 10 points. So if you lose me, it's minus 10 from this. If you get this, get my ballot, then it's plus 10. Then there is a range where if you get a near unanimous decision, you get, or if you get a near unanimous defeat, it's minus 15. And then if you get a in-between defeat, it's minus 10. And then if you're just barely beat, it's minus 7, is the way it works. And so what this means is that if no one in the class votes for you and I don't vote for you, then your base grade is a 45, and then say you're the worst speaker that you could potentially be, is then a 27.5, which means that if you show up, your lowest grade that you could get for a debate is a 72.5. All right, now that I'm sure is not going to make all of you very ecstatic because no one's that's a great grade, but that's the lowest grade you could theoretically get if you're just here. If you are not here, then you get a 0, right? And that will devastate your grade. And remember, if you just show up, it's mathematically set so that way you'll, not be able to get sort of less than a B if you just continuously show up to class and you do all these sort of minimum things. But chances are you're not going to lose every debate by losing my ballot, losing the entirety of the class. So most debates, you're not subtracting 25 from this base grade, but you're maybe subtracting 27, and you're normally getting like a 28.5. So your grades are normally, for most people, end up being sort of like the normal debate grades are normally sort of like between a 85 to a 95, or most of the debate grades that end up hitting the book. Okay? So that's not on the quiz, that's just so you know how the debates themselves are actually ended up being graded. Okay? And then when we get to the elimination rounds, the ballots that you fill out if you have been eliminated, or the debates that you're having if you have not been eliminated, function as extra credit to pad some of those grades as well. So that way the worst speakers in the class and who continuously showed up have ways to make up for it. And if you shine in the other areas of the class, like if you have a public debate and you get more than 100 people, there are other ways to balance this thing. And so there are people who earn an A in this class and go 0-4 in the class tournament because they do good everywhere else on the syllabus. And there are people who go 4-0 in the class tournament and then end up with a B+ or A- because they just sort of dropped the ball on a bunch of other sorts of things. The class tournament is certainly important, and you don't want to be the 0-4 team that has lost everything. But if you are the 0-4 team and no one in the class has ever voted for you and you've always gotten the 27.5, you are not really more than a B student in this class, to level with you. So, but there are the other elements that help make up for it as well. All right, questions on these? Okay, so the next series of quiz questions are all set around like what are the different ways you can answer a dissent, a counterplan, a procedural argument, so on and so forth. So they're all quiz questions that I will ask, give me 4 ways to answer one of the off-case arguments. You'll have to list them. So, for a disad, they are simply no link, not unique, no internal link, no impact. So if you notice, I just added the word no in front of all of them because if you could disprove any chain in that event, then it's not a reason to vote against you. So it's just the same as quiz question 1 from the first quiz, just with the words no in front of them. Now, you could also say case outweighs. And what that means is that your affirmative case is a bigger impact. Even if they are right about their disad, it doesn't matter because we have a bigger impact. Case outweighs. All right. You could also have a link turn and an impact turn. And quiz question is, what is a link turn and what is an impact turn and how do they differ? A link turn says you do the opposite of the link. So if they say you hurt the economy because you cost money, you say actually no, we help the economy because a single payer will save the economy and save money. Right? So it's the opposite of the link. An impact turn is where you say the impact is actually a good idea. Yes, we crash the economy, but capitalist systems of growth are really bad, and so crashing the economy is a good thing, right? And so a link turn says we do the opposite of the link. The impact turn says the impact is actually a good thing, okay? Now, you can't do both of these together because that's called a double turn. Quiz question, what is a double turn? A double turn is where you run a link turn and an impact turn at the same time, and that means you say something like the lines of, we save the economy because we save money, and saving the economy is bad because capitalism's evil. Because then the other team could be like, all right, we agree, the economy was going to collapse, you save it, which means you perpetuate an evil system, and so the other team could just agree with everything you've said, and you've run the disadvantage in the opposite direction against yourself, okay? So you have to, when someone runs a disadvantage, you should be like, is it better for me to attack the link level, say we do the opposite there, or the impact level, and you sort of decide them, and that functions as sort of offense, okay? So all of these are ways you can answer a disadvantage. Quiz question will ask for like 4 or 5 of them. Anything you can list extra is extra credit. What is a link turn and an impact turn? How do they differ? And what is a double turn? Yeah?
Can you say what an impact turn was again?
Impact turn says the impact is actually a good thing. So it turns the impact level of the disad. Okay?
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah?
Brief explanation of double turn one more time.
Double turn is where you run a link turn and an impact turn at the same time.
Okay.
All right? And so goal is don't do that. Other questions? Okay. So, how to answer a counterplan then? The first thing that you could say to a counterplan is you could say it's that it doesn't solve the case. And what this means is that the counterplan can't solve for your affirmative impacts. If a counterplan could solve all the people who are dying from health, then it's just as good as your affirmative, so any reason why it might be better is a reason to vote for the counterplan. So you could prove that it doesn't solve for the case. Okay? You could prove that it's topical, and that equals a reason to affirm if you want, right? Which is the opposite of trying to prove that it is not topical. You could run disads to the counterplan. You could run procedurals to the counterplan. And you could run critiques to the counterplan. And again, just be careful because you don't want to run a disadvantage that will link to the counterplan and yourself. Or you don't want to run a critique that will link to to the counterplan and yourself. You could also have a permutation or a perm. Okay. Now there is a separate quiz question on what is a permutation and what are the two types of off-case arguments you can use it to answer. Counterplan is the first type, critique will be the second. A permutation explains that we could do them at the same time. And so it's like, if you think math, different permutations of possibilities, right? So it's like if somebody says the state government should do it and you say, and it's like federal government versus states, we get the states and the federal government do it at the same time. So perm. And so a permutation is you could do the two things together is the definition of a perm. Counterplan is one of the off-case arguments you use to answer. Critique is another type of off-case argument. You could use it to answer. Okay? The other thing that you could say against counterplans, in addition to it doesn't solve the case, is that you could also say that there's no net benefit. So if it links to the disadvantage as well, and there's no reason for why it's net beneficial, they would vote for you. Okay? Any questions? Again, I'll ask for like 4 or 5 of them, and anything extra you could get extra credit. Yeah?
For the permutations, when you say like you could do them both at the same time, you mean like the counterplan that you're proposing and affirmative?
Yep,
Right? Okay.
exactly. So for the critique, how to answer them, you could say no link. We don't do the racist, sexist, homophobic, specious thing you talk about. You could say no impact. So the impact doesn't matter. Be careful. It's not, you don't want to be like racism doesn't matter. So it normally comes across, instead of just saying no impact, it normally comes across more like case outweighs. Even if racism is bad, saving lives is more important, opposed to just being like, racism doesn't matter, sexism doesn't matter, along those lines. You could also say no solvency, which is just the alternative doesn't work, just critiquing the system doesn't do anything. You could also have a permutation again, so this is the second argument. You could be like, we could critique racism and do single payer at the same time. There's no reason why we can't do them together. So if you could prove them that they'd be done together, that works as well. And you can also run counter critiques, which is just like if somebody runs a critique of feminism, queer theorists would criticize feminism, so would critical race theory and vice versa, right? So it's like you could pick another literature base that would criticize their literature base. You can also have a link turn and an impact turn, which is just, we actually solve for sexism, racism, homophobia. Or, again, be careful, sexism, racism, homophobia is a good thing because our military needs to be racist, sexist, and homophobic in order to have the military might and not care about killing people indiscriminately, and that's necessary to protect the American empire, and American lives comes first to secure U.S. hegemony. And if you think you could win that debate, that would be an example of an impact turn to it. But generally, you would sort of try and figure out different ways where it would not necessarily, if somebody runs a critique of like racism, sexism, homophobia, generally doubling down on, no, that's a good thing is not the recommended strategy, because there's normally better ways to sort of interact with that. All right? And so those are different ways that you can answer critiques. When you talk about case ways, a lot of times that comes down to like a pre-fiat, post-fiat distinction about like why talking about policy matters in relationship to things. All right? Procedural argument?
Can I add something real quick?
Sure.
Also, another way you can link turn is not just link turning, say you solve, but you can say they make it worse, i.e., say they're saying they want to solve for sexism, racism, ableism. You could say their alternative creates more forms of those violences. So that's another way that you can kind of link turn their debate by saying that their alternative causes the impacts that they're trying to say you cause.
Right, and there's a lot of literature that's like this feminist movement, this race movement actually is causing more racism and causing more, sexism because of the tactics that they're using, and you could debate that portion of it as well. Yeah?
So the link terms are used when there's no link, or they're used, you could use them in
Well,
general for
if it's no link, it's like we just have nothing to do with this. It's like I don't know why you're suddenly talking about animals in this debate. We have no application to speciesism whatsoever, just no link. Whereas a link turn is like we actually help end animal testing because single payer would eliminate the incentives to go ahead and test on animals, right? And so we're saying we do the opposite of a link. So no link is sort of defensive. Don't vote against me on this argument because it doesn't apply to me. Link turn is vote for me because actually we solve for this argument. Or impact is actually this is a good thing that we caused, so you should vote for me because we caused this good thing. Alright, so the turns are more offensive. These other ones are sort of more defensive. So it's like if you win there's no impact to decay, you don't win the debate round, you just don't lose on the critique. There might be another argument that you would lose the debate round on. And so as I was saying earlier, a lot of part of debate when you get to the rebuttals is teams will be like, a negative team will be like, okay, concede there's no impact to the critique. We're not going for it. The disadvantage is going to be where you vote, and then they spend more time on the disadvantage, so they go for a different argument. So in a debate, you'll generally use a couple of different arguments. Other questions? Okay. How to answer a procedural argument? The first thing that you could do is you could have a counter interpretation, which if they say is like, you have to specify how single payer is going to be enacted, you could say counter interpretation. We don't. We just have to say single payer, and that gives you enough ground to debate. You just give a different definition of what the rule should be. They say the rule should be this. You counter with a different rule. The next thing you could say is we meet, which means that you meet their violation. I would also accept no violation here, which is just that they say you talk too fast, and you're like, we meet, or we don't violate that. I talk conversation speed. This is the speed I talk at. So, you just no violation. Then you have counter standards, which is just they say depth is good, we say breadth is good. So here are different standards for what makes for a good or bad debate. You could also say no voters, or no voters or no voting issues. And that just is like, it's not worth voting against me on this argument. There's no voting issue. There's no reason to vote against me, so no voters. And you could also say case outweighs. Even if we violate your silly rule, what we talk about is more important, and you should vote for us because of that, even if we might be unfair. Okay? And these are different ways to answer procedural arguments. Okay? So, that part of the quiz is all just like, give me 4 ways to answer one of these off-case arguments. If you get more, it's extra credit. The extra quiz questions are, what is a link turn? What is an impact turn and how they differ, which means just give me the definitions of them. What is a double turn? Writing them both at the same time. What is a permutation? And what are the 2 types of off-case arguments you can use to answer? Counterplan, critique, and a perm means that we could do both things at the same time. Okay? Earlier quiz questions are, what are the 3 ways to compare evidence? What are the 3 ways to compare impacts? What are the 5 rules of judging? What is the speaker point range? Okay, and then also how many points do you lose for not speaking for each 30 seconds you don't speak? Yeah?
There's 2 parts for the permutation question.
Yep.
It was what is a permutation, and then what was the second one?
What are the 2 types of off-case arguments you can use to answer? So if you could say do both, critique, and counterplan, that's full credit. Because permutation means to do both ideas together, and then critique and counterplan is the answers to the second part. All right. Any other questions? Okay.